Welcome to our fifth and final session in our online conference, Researching English Eastern Canada. In this session, we'll delve into the unique resources, strategies, and history of Newfoundland and Labrador. Our instructor for this session is archivist Judy Lucey. Judy joined the NEHGS staff in 2003. She received a BS in Education from Northeastern University and an MS in Library and Information Science from Simmons College. Her genealogical interests include Irish genealogy, Newfoundland, 19th and 20th century genealogy, beginning genealogy, Italian family history, and the history of Cambridge and Somerville, Massachusetts. So please join me in welcoming Judy Lucey.
Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for listening today. For the next hour, we're going to be immersing ourselves in the place that the Irish call the land of the fish and natives call the Rock, otherwise known as the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. We're going to take a step back in time to learn a little bit about Newfoundland history and the records and resources that are available in the province and discover what makes this province so unique. My own personal roots run deep in the province, and I'll be sharing some examples from my own family research throughout the presentation, so let's get started. If there is one word that sums up the history of Newfoundland and Labrador, that word is cod. For centuries, the codfish brought Europeans to the shores of Newfoundland and Labrador, the French, the Basque, the Portuguese, and eventually the English fished in its coastal waters. Early in its history as a British colony for the first couple of centuries, settlement was discouraged. This was a seasonal fishery where people came in the spring and summer and fished, and then returned home to England in the fall. Seasonal fishing gave way to the temporary settler, where men would fish for the summer and stay over for a winter or two, and it was from these temporary settlers that permanent settlers emerged, so that by the mid to late 18th century, permanent settlement really took hold in the province. Its geography and climate have also played a role in the settlement of Newfoundland and Labrador and its people. Newfoundland is the easternmost province in Canada. Most of the people that worked in the fishery lived and settled on the coast, and it's still very much that way today. Much of the interior of Labrador and even Newfoundland is still uninhabitable land. By the mid-19th century, Newfoundland was granted self-government, but its economic and political struggles would continue into the 20th century, culminating in its membership in the Confederation of Canada in 1949. So the history of this province has a direct impact on genealogical research and the records available to us. Because the British looked upon Newfoundland as an industry, as a business just for money making and through the cod fishery, it did not look at it as a colony. Therefore, the legal, social, and political institutions that would normally develop as people settled in a province were very slow to develop. So there's really no early organization of records. There are no counties or townships that were formed. Records today are arranged by district and municipality. Fires and poor record keeping have created gaps in records, and there is a strong reliance on family lore in Newfoundland because of the lack of records. Oral history plays a very important role in family history research. One of the things that you really do need to know in order to research in Newfoundland is you need to know the exact place. That's key, very much like other Atlantic Canadian provinces. We're going to talk a little bit about migration and settlement patterns in the next few minutes, and I'm going to focus on the two major groups that settled in Newfoundland, the English and the Irish. So much of the fishing trade operations were based in southwest England, in the port cities of Bristol, and then eventually by the mid-18th century, the other cities of Plymouth, Tynemouth, and Poole. These cities dominated the Newfoundland fishery. These men that served in the fishery came from the small towns and farming communities in the counties of Devon, Dorset, Somerset, and Hampshire, known collectively as West Countrymen. Many also came from the Channel Islands of Guernsey and Jersey. Some had experience in the fishery, but many did not. Many were farmers, artisans, laborers, in other words, the laboring poor. So where did the English settle when they came to Newfoundland? Well, here's a map depicting the English shore. And you can see in the dark and red that the English shore in the 1600s was from the north, from the Bonavista in Bonavista Bay, down through St. John's, along the Avalon Peninsula into Trepassey. Many from various parts of the southwest England settled in the city of St. John's and in the towns of Conception Bay. For example, Dorset immigrants settled in Carbonear and Brigus, and joining them from Carbonear to Pays de Verde are folks from Somerset and Hampshire. There was a large group from Devon and Jersey that settled in Harbour Grace and Bay Roberts. As you study the migration and settlement patterns of your ancestors, it's helpful to consult secondary sources written by scholars who have studied the communities and the families that have lived there. For example, an excellent source for English settlement in Newfoundland is W. Gordon Hancock's So Long as There Comes No Women. Hancock studied many of the early families that settled along that English shore using records in Newfoundland and Great Britain. Once found in just a handful of libraries, this book has now been digitized and placed on the Digital Archives Initiative at Memorial University, and I have provided a URL for this book in your handout. The city of Waterford, Ireland became a major port for English ships to obtain supplies and labor on their way to Newfoundland. And by the mid-18th and early 19th centuries, more Irish servants were being recruited to work the fisheries, and many of them came from the southeast counties of Waterford, Wexford, Kilkenny, Tipperary, and East Cork. Dr. John Mannion, a Galway man and professor of geography at Memorial University, studied Irish immigration to Newfoundland. And the peak periods for this migration was between 1811 and 1815 during the Napoleonic Wars, and again in 1825 and 1831. And also in Dr. Mannion's research of the Irish, he noticed that with most Irish came to Newfoundland from within a 25 to 30-mile radius of the city of Waterford. Now the map that you see here and the corresponding table is the results of John Mannion's research. He traced the parish origins of over 5,000 Irish immigrants to Newfoundland and the county of origins for another 2,000. And he did this by studying the county of origins in the marriage records in St. John's Catholic Church records. And you can see by the color coding in the map that most people, the darkest shade, came from County Kilkenny, and after that, County Waterford and Wexford, with the least amount coming from County Carlow. So the Irish dominated the Avalon Peninsula when they came into Newfoundland, primarily St. John's and south, along the coast as to what is now called the Irish Loop. And the city of St. John seems to be that dividing line ethnically, where there was an equal number of English and Irish who settled there. But there's also large Irish communities that developed north of St. John's into the Conception Bay area in the towns of Harbour Grace and Carbonear. And also further north into Bonavista Bay in Kings Cove and Bonavista, and in the communities of Tilting and Fogo in Notre Dame Bay. I want to just talk briefly about Labrador. The province of Newfoundland and Labrador today is home to 4 peoples of Aboriginal ancestry. And Labrador is home to at least 3 of them: the Inuit, the Innu, and there's also the Southern Inuit. These are a mix of European and native peoples of Labrador. Labrador's history is very similar to Newfoundland's early history in that it was a fishing colony. There wasn't a lot of permanent settlement. It was used by Basque whalers in the 16th century, and even later New England whalers fished off the waters. The earliest settlements came from English and German Moravian missions. The first was established in 1771, and there have been more than a dozen in Labrador, and some of them are still active today. The other earliest European settlement came from the Hudson Bay Company. Since the early 1800s, Newfoundland and Quebec had been in a border dispute over the Labrador region. However, in 1927, the British government ruled that the area known today as modern-day Labrador was to be considered part of Newfoundland. So researchers should note that because at some time in its history it belonged to Quebec, for example, parts of Labrador are enumerated in the 1871 and 1911 census in Quebec. So just as soon as people arrived in Newfoundland for fishing, they also started to leave. As a matter of fact, the first Irish that settled in Halifax, Nova Scotia were from Newfoundland. Now, before Confederation in 1949, out-migration was predominantly coming into the United States, with specific peak periods in the 19th century of about 1840 to 1860, and then again in 1880 to 1900. Now, these periods corresponded with economic downturn in Newfoundland and also a great number of fires, particularly in the city of St. John's. And then there was another, after World War I, there was another out-migration between 1919 to 1934, and this is when my own family came to the States. The majority of people in this time period were coming to what is known as the Boston States, the city of Boston, and the fishing communities of Gloucester, New Bedford, Fall River. They also went beyond New England into Brooklyn and New York City. Today, out-migration continues, but they're going into a different location. Many of them are going to other parts of Canada, into the cities of Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, British Columbia. So I've talked a little bit about its history and people and settlements. Now I'd like to transition and start getting into talking about records and genealogical research. Whenever we tackle our family history, we always have to come up with a plan. And the first thing I think with Newfoundland or Labrador ancestry is you have to look at the records where your ancestors settled. So in my case, my family came into Massachusetts. And it's always good to use the tried and true research methodology of working from the known to the unknown. Your research may have a back and forth process to it, and that's because our ancestors moved back and forth from the States back to the province of Newfoundland, and it happened in my own family. You want to use a variety of primary and secondary sources, and it's also good when you're using secondary sources to learn a little bit about Newfoundland history, and more importantly, looking at the local history where your ancestors settled. And when you do that, you also want to identify the surrounding communities, because as you dig into the records, you may need to use records in these other communities. So I thought I'd just share with you my own direct line. My Newfoundland ancestors all came from Ireland, and they settled in the Avalon Peninsula. And where you see the red arrow at the map in the middle, my ancestors settled in the Argentia and Placentia area. You'll see my great-grandparents here at the bottom of the screen, Catherine O'Keefe and William O'Brien. They were the first to come to the States. And as you can see from my Foley and O'Brien line, I have enough information of dates of birth or estimated dates of birth and dates of death. But on my O'Keefe side, and this is typical of Newfoundland research, I've had to rely on family lore and when traditional sources weren't available, and also from information from Newfoundland cousins. And you're going to find the very same as you begin your research. So the ability to access primary source material from a distance is really crucial to Newfoundland genealogical research. So the place, of course, to begin is online. And we're fortunate to have two excellent online sources, the Newfoundland Grand Bank's website and the Newfoundland Gen website. And we're going to discuss each in a moment. In addition, there is now a growing set of records on family search and ancestry, and I'll be talking about those as well. But there's also a very unique source that you should be aware of. If you've researched in Newfoundland, you may be already aware of this, and it's E.R. Series Family Names of the Island of Newfoundland. Dr. Series studied the history of surnames in Newfoundland, and he studied the place of origin in England and Ireland, and also where these surnames settled in the province. He looked at where the surname occurred in early records, the distribution of the surname in Newfoundland, and he also studied family tradition. So I want to show you an example if you've not used this source, or maybe it's been a long time. This is a page from the Foley surname. And where you see in the red box under family tradition, this is my fourth great-grandfather. So it says Mike, 1796-1879, came to Newfoundland in 1815 from Ireland and settled at Fox Harbor. And then in parenthesis is the source that Dr. Seary extracted it from. And this is from a student paper at the Maritime History Archives. So MUN stands for Memorial University, and geography is the course that the student took. You'll see also underneath that are early instances where the Foley name occurred, and he extracts those names from the records. Keep in mind that Seary was more interested in origins. This is not a genealogical dictionary. All right, so he wasn't interested in the research of actual families. But also, this isn't just a book that you're going to look at when you first start out, but it's one that you may go back to as you learn more about your Newfoundland ancestors and you're adding more surnames to the family tree. So I mentioned Grand Banks. This is the Newfoundland Grand Banks website that's been in existence since 1998. And it's when it started as a volunteer project to transcribe and digitize the 1921 census. And today it now houses the largest amount of original material available online for Newfoundland research. And it has everything from historical articles to will transcriptions, obituaries, headstone photos. Everything is here that you can think of. The other website is the Newfoundland Gen website. What I like about this website is that they have divided up the records by region and then subdivided them into districts, so it makes it easier to kind of just go to the place where your ancestor is from. There is overlap with records with the Grand Banks. They don't have as many records as Grand Banks has put on, but I would recommend you use both in your research. If you don't know where to start on either site, each offers a search engine that allows you to search the entire website. So civil registration in Newfoundland, like other Atlantic Canadian provinces, starts late and doesn't begin until 1891. So since many of our ancestors settled in Newfoundland in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, we have to turn to church and other records to fill the gaps. Like any record set, there are strengths and weaknesses to using church records in Newfoundland. The church record may be the only surviving record that links one generation to another, where you may identify parents' names or the maiden name of a mother. Some of the oldest settled areas in Newfoundland, such as St. John's, and communities in Conception Bay, such as Harbour Harbor Grace, have church records that begin in the 18th century. The majority of records begin late in most other places, sometimes not starting until 1850 or later. And unfortunately for some of us, by this time, the first and perhaps the second generation has already been baptized and married. Clergymen in Newfoundland covered a wide area, frequently by boat, and sometimes were unable to visit remote locations. Good record keeping in these church records depended on the local clergy. So some clergy were more diligent than others in maintaining their parish records, so you may find gaps. Fire has damaged many a record in Newfoundland, and church records unfortunately have not been spared from that fate. The Anglican Church was established as the established religion in Newfoundland in 1583 when Humphrey Gilbert sailed into the port of St. John's with his royal charter and established Newfoundland as a colony for England. And much of the earliest records are in areas such as Trinity, Harbor Grace, Bona Vista, and of course the city of St. John's. The Anglican church records begin for marriages in 1752 with baptisms for 1790. In 1766, the Reverend Coughlin, who is considered the founder of Methodism in Newfoundland, arrived in the Conception Bay area. Raised a Roman Catholic in his native Ireland, he converted to Methodism in 1753 and was somewhat of a protege of John Wesley. Somewhere along in his life, he became an ordained Anglican clergyman and was sent to Newfoundland to serve the Anglican community. However, he never forgot his Methodist roots and began preaching and converting many Anglican to the Methodist movement. And it really took hold in Newfoundland, and there was very rapid growth of Methodism through the area, and it still flourishes today. Reverend Coughlin's tenure was short in Ireland, but he left a long and lasting history in the Methodist Church. So when you're researching your Protestant ancestors, it's really important to search multiple denominations because your ancestors may have moved back and forth. They may have started out as Anglican, moved into Methodist. They may have gone into the Baptist Church or other religions. So it's important to search multiple denominations when you're using church records. So as Ireland had penal laws restricting Irish from practicing their faith, those penal laws follow the Irish to Newfoundland. And it wasn't until the 1780s that the Irish were allowed to practice their Roman Catholic faith in Newfoundland. The earliest church records that you will find for Roman Catholics are in St. John's at the Basilica, with marriages beginning in 1793 and baptisms in 1802. One of the wonderful things about the registers here at St. John's is that many of the marriages record the place of origin, like you see here for the 1821 marriage of Patrick Shanahan from Mooncoin, County Kilkenny, to Margaret Stafford of Tommen, County Wexford. But Harbor Grace area also has early records, with baptisms starting in 1806, and Kings Cove, which had a large Irish population. Their baptisms and marriages begin 1815. Burials, although not a sacrament, begin much later in Catholic registers in Newfoundland. So there are two major databases I want to point out to you that are online that you should consider researching. The first is the Newfoundland Church Records from 1793 to 1949. These are mostly Roman Catholic records for about 10 communities in Newfoundland, including the city of St. John's. There is the same database is on Ancestry, But you'll notice that there's a slightly different date range for this. It is index only with links to the images on Family Search. The other big database for church records is called Newfoundland Vital Statistics 1753 to 1893. And that title may throw you off because when we think of vital statistics, we think of civil birth, marriages, and deaths. Now, these are actually church transcriptions, mostly from Protestant churches with a handful of Roman Catholics. And the reason they're called vital statistics is because of a program started in the 1940s by the Department of Public Health and Welfare in Newfoundland. In that time period, they had decided that they needed to gather up pre-1891 births, marriages, and deaths from the churches. Many original parish registers in Newfoundland were in deteriorating condition, and also many had been lost through fire. So they had started this program with church transcriptions, and many did respond, and some beyond the 1893 date. The same database is available on Ancestry, but again, notice slightly different name of births, marriages, and deaths, and slightly different date range. And again, index only, and it links to the images on Family Search. In addition, you'll also find many church transcriptions on the two Newfoundland genealogy websites. So I've mentioned civil registration, so why don't we spend a few minutes talking about that. So civil registration begins, as I mentioned, 1891, but then you'll see here that I also say 1892. Now, why is that? Well, that's because of the Great Fire of 1892 in the city of St. John's that destroyed some of the 1891 civil registration records. Up until 1948, the clergy in Newfoundland and Labrador were responsible for submitting the information to civil authorities. So what does that mean? That means if you look at a marriage record, and I'll use my great-grandparents' 1913 marriage record as an example, the two people listed there outside of the bride and groom are not the parents, but the two witnesses to the marriage. Now, Newfoundland Vital Records are online, and they come from the microfilmed of birth, marriages, and deaths. Births only cover up to 1899 from the microfilm, and that's what you'll find online. Marriages up to 1922, and deaths to 1949. But this collection also includes late registrations of births from 1840 to about 1915. Now, if someone didn't register their birth and it took more than a year, that was considered a delayed birth or a late registration, so you'll find those here. But in addition, many people born to 1891 needed proof of birth. So you'll also find documents in this collection such as baptismal records, sworn affidavits of when someone was born, extracts from family Bibles, etc. And again, these vital records you'll find on two databases. The one on Family Search is called Newfoundland Vital Records 1840 to 49, and the same, again, slightly different name, slightly different date range is found on Ancestry. So here's an example from my own family from the late registrations of birth. And this is a record of baptism from the Sacred Heart Parish for my great-grandmother, Catherine Frances Keefe, who was baptized on the 4th of October, 1890. And this was issued by the parish priest at the time on August 8, 1924. Now, why would my great-grandmother need this document? Well, at this time, she was preparing to come to the United States, and probably felt at that time that she would need something to prove her date of birth. So let's talk about birth, marriages, and death substitutes. You know, with civil registration beginning so late and church records can be sporadic or unavailable, we're going to need to turn to other sources to fill the gaps on the family tree. Over the years, Newfoundland cemeteries have greatly deteriorated due to harsh weather and general neglect. But Thanks to organizations such as the Family History Society of Newfoundland and Labrador and other volunteer groups, many surviving cemeteries have been transcribed. Now, the Family History Society has a couple of databases online. They have a headstone searchable database, and they have some additional cemetery transcriptions on their websites. Unfortunately, you do need to be a member to access that. But there is another resource available, a genealogist, and that's stonepicks.com. Stonepicks is an organization whose mission is to photograph and index all Newfoundland headstones, memorials, and monuments. You can purchase a single photo from their website, or if you're like me, you need a CD-ROM for the entire cemetery because you're related to about 2/3 of the people in there. What I like about having Stonepicks available to us is that while transcriptions of cemetery records are great, they also can be full of errors, and so this way you have actual photographs of the headstones. Stonepicks index is also on Grand Banks, and both of GenWeb and the Grand Bank site have transcriptions of cemetery records as well. So here's an example of a headstone. This is my 4th great-grandfather who erected this headstone in memory of his wife, Elizabeth. And this headstone is in the Freshwater Cemetery in the Argentia area in Newfoundland. Since the parish records for Argentia don't begin until 1835, and there's little or no burial records, this headstone provided me with information missing on my family tree. I have no birth record for Elizabeth. I assume she was born in Newfoundland, but I have no knowledge of that. So the fact that I've been given her full date of birth along with her age, I can at least estimate a year of birth. But I also discovered something else that's interesting in this headstone, and that is that there is another person here buried by the name of Peter Smith. So I know from family lore and the baptisms of her 3 youngest children that Elizabeth's maiden name is Smith. So here I've now picked up another possible relation, perhaps a brother. So now I have another clue to go on because I really don't know very much about Elizabeth. So here again, I've picked up another family member. Newspapers also have lots of birth, marriages, and death information, not just in Newfoundland, but throughout Atlantic Canada. The earliest papers in Newfoundland begin in 1806 in the city of St. John's. Now, there are 2 individuals whose work in extracting genealogical information from Newfoundland newspapers is invaluable to family historians. And between the 2 of them, you get fairly good coverage for the 19th century. The 2 are Gertrude Crosby and Mildred Howard. Unfortunately, Mildred Howard's work, which are published in multiple volumes, are not available online. I've provided some information about them in your handout, and just so you know, we do have those volumes in our library. But I do want to talk about Gertrude Crosby's work. She compiled vital records from various newspapers in St. John's and also eastern Newfoundland. These were published volumes. And in 2004, the Maritime History Archives published a CD-ROM version of her publications, and they added material dating back to 1810. Now you'll see here the index now is on Ancestry.com, and I've provided an example again of my 4th great-grandfather Michael Foley. This is an extract of his death notice. It provides an estimated year of birth of 1790 because he died on the 8th of April 1879 at the age of 89. It also gives me a list of the newspapers where I can find this death notice, and it extracts interesting data that would be key for genealogical research. So his death notice included that he left 12 children, 102 grandchildren, and 35 great-great-grandchildren behind. So you can see I have my work cut out for me in Newfoundland. But Memorial University, in conjunction with the Digital Archives Initiative, is now beginning to digitize original newspapers and place them online for free. And the two Newfoundland genealogy websites have long had newspaper transcriptions. So between the three, you get plenty of coverage for newspaper transcriptions of birth, marriage, and death records. So let's talk a minute about land and estate records. You know, we always turn to birth, marriage, finding birth, marriage, and death records first when we begin our family history, and then eventually we may turn to land and probate records to supplement our family history. And it's no different in Newfoundland. Prior to the early 19th century, only those individuals in the fishery could own land. And many of our ancestors settled in remote communities. And because of that, most of our ancestors actually had land without legal title. In other words, technically they were squatters. There are two forms of land registry in Newfoundland. First is the Crown Land Grants, and then the Registry of Deeds. Now, both of these record sets have been filmed by the Family History Library in Salt Lake City. Unfortunately, they have not digitized these microfilms yet, so there's nothing online. There is a free index for the Crown Land Grants on the Grand Bank's website, and there's also an index to an interesting collection of records called Miscellaneous Deeds and Wills, 1744 to 1859. And this includes all kinds of records, including marriage settlements, some military records, land transfers, etc. And recently, it's been digitized and it's online at the Family History Society of Newfoundland and Labrador. Unfortunately, you do need to be a member to access the actual records, but as I mentioned, there's a free index on the Grand Bank's website. In terms of probate records, most probate records that were done before 1832, you can either find at the Registry of Deeds or at the Supreme Court of St. John's. After 1832, all wills and estate records were filed through the probate office of the Supreme Court, and eventually this was broken out into districts throughout the province. The Family History Library in Salt Lake City has filmed a lot of Newfoundland and Labrador wills, and they've digitized them, and you can access them through their online catalog. So here's an example from the Supreme Court of Newfoundland. This is a letter of administration of Patrick Britt. This is the type of record that as genealogists we hope to find. It is full of little genealogical nuggets. For example, in addition to finding out that Patrick resides at Carbonear and his occupation is cooper, we learn that he drowned sometime before this letter of administration was filed in November of 1806. In addition, it gives us his place of origin in Ireland, Carrick-on-Suir in County Tipperary. It tells us who his heirs are, his wife Ellen and son, who still live in Ireland, and it also gives us the maiden name of his wife, Cullinane. In addition, it mentions a brother John, and if that isn't enough, an illegitimate daughter shows up who was born in Newfoundland and claims and wants to claim a share of her father's estate. Now, one of the things I love about researching my Newfoundland ancestors is that it really challenges me as a genealogist. It has forced me to really think outside the box. And sooner or later, that will happen to each and every one of you, because we need to combine those traditional sources with those records unique to the province in order to trace our family history. So some of those records you will need are really tied or related to the fishery. For example, one of them is mercantile records, business records. These can be an important genealogical source as many of our ancestors were employed by the large fishing merchants. These collections can contain business ledgers, indentures, diaries, and correspondence. They also can be helpful in locating early ancestors, people that may have settled in the mid to late 18th century, and their origins. The business ledgers of John Slade and Company, for example, provide lists of names of the early settlers of the Twillingate Fogo area. Most of these business records can be found in one of two repositories, the Maritime History Archive and the Provincial Archives, known as the Rooms, but you do need to take a look. Some of them are held locally in local historical societies. Another important collection is the Keith Matthews collection, and some of you may be familiar with this. Keith Matthews was a professor of history at Memorial University, and here we see an example of his collection. This is Jacob Taylor of Port de Grave, and what Dr. Matthews did is that he collected data on individuals and families who were tied to the Newfoundland fishery from the 1500s to about 1850. And he used a number of records, census, shipping records, parish registers from Newfoundland and Great Britain. And here is an example of his work, and I want to point your attention to the right, the box I have. Dr. Matthews' work was very succinct and brief. He used a lot of abbreviations. His work is organized by surname and then subdivided by given name. So we have this Jacob Taylor of Port de Grave, and it says here 1755. It tells us something about Jacob, that he cleared a plantation. And I offer you here the translation in full. And so in 1755, Jacob Taylor cleared plantation number 75 in Port de Grave, and it had stage, flake, 4 houses and 2 gardens. In other words, he had a fishing room and a number of houses and 2 gardens. This was extracted from the Colonial Office Records series number 199, volume 18. Now, these have been completely digitized. They are online for free at the Maritime History Archives, and there also is a key to all the abbreviations that Dr. Matthews used when recording these entries. We've mentioned some repositories, so let's talk about them a little bit. Some of the major repositories, what they offer, and what you can access from home. The first stop for any of us is the Rooms, the Provincial Archives of Newfoundland and Labrador. Here, their primary purpose is to collect the records for the government of Newfoundland and Labrador. But one of their more important collections is the 200 parish registers that they have. These are photocopies only, but they cover a great deal of the province. There is an online parish guide so that you can look to see what they have for a complete list of their holdings. In addition, I mentioned that they also have business records, and it was there at the Rooms in 2009 that I used the fishing merchants Saunders and Sweetman firm records. Their firm, they recruited heavily out of Waterford. They were in the Placentia area, and many of my ancestors worked for this firm, and I was lucky enough to find some of them in their records. In addition, we really need to think again outside the box and take a look at a variety of manuscript collections that the Rooms may have. A couple of unique ones would be sort of focused on community and family. One of them is the Don Morris Correspondence Collection. Don was an archivist at the Provincial Archives. He often answered genealogical inquiries that came in from all over the world. His collection consists of these letters and his detailed responses. Another is the Nimshi Crew collection. Nimshi was an antiquarian, historian who collected everything on Newfoundland. His writings and notes and research focus on families and communities throughout the province. And I'll be showing you an example of that very shortly. The Family History Society of Newfoundland and Labrador has partnered recently with the Rooms to digitize some of their records and bring them online. And this is very exciting for all of us, as it's, Newfoundland is a remote distance, and currently the Rooms is closed. They have digitized in the last year or two court records, wills, probate, voters list, Newfoundland passports. and the miscellaneous deeds and wills collection that I mentioned. Access to this collection of records is limited to members. Membership at the Family History Society is $42 US. However, I do recommend membership in this organization. They offer not only records from the rooms, but a lot more online. Memorial University and their archives and libraries offer genealogists a treasure trove of Newfoundland and Labrador resources. Now I'm going to focus in a few minutes on the Maritime History Archive and the Digital Archive Initiative. But I just want to mention two other archives of interest. The first is the Center for Newfoundland Studies. This is a special research collection. It focuses on the study of all aspects of Newfoundland and Labrador, and their holdings include historic maps, government records, newspapers, student theses, periodicals, etc. And then there's another unusual one we may not even consider when we're doing family history, and that's the Folklore and Language Archive. This archive holds over 40,000 oral histories. Many of these were done by students who conducted interviews of people who lived in communities, particularly remote communities, throughout the province. There's also family charts, and there's a card file of names and places. And so for genealogists, this really offers us a unique collection that may help supplement our family history. So let's turn our attention now to the Maritime History Archive and the Digital Archive Initiative. I mentioned the Keith Matthews name files, and the exciting thing is that they've finally digitized this and it is now online. Another digitization project is the Newfoundland crew lists and agreements. This is now online on their archive, and it's also now online at Ancestry.com. But there are two other collections that they have that I want to bring your attention to. And one is the student research papers. Some of you may be familiar with this, but perhaps some of you have not. The student papers consist of over 5,000 papers. These were created by students who took course of study in Newfoundland history, geography, anthropology, and they were deposited by their professors at the archive. The collection of note that as genealogists we should pay attention to is Dr. John Mannion's student papers from his geography class. He required his students to construct family trees, usually 3 or 4 generations, and examine settlement patterns in a specific community. And I've had the pleasure of using these at the Maritime History Archives, and I'd like to show you some of what my findings were. So here's an example. The page on the left is a student paper that focused on the community of Fox Harbor, where my family was from, and it studied the settlement patterns and the growth of Fox Harbor through the 19th and 20th centuries. This page outlines the community of Fox Harbor and shows the location and the owners of the fishing rooms in Fox Harbor in 1857. And you see where the red arrow is? That's where my 4th great-grandfather Michael Foley had his fishing room and his family homestead. The paper on the right was a paper that focused on the Foley family itself from Fox Harbor. It included 4-generation charts right down to my great-grandparents, and this page shows the 3rd generation living on Michael Foley's property. Okay, Michael parceled out his land to his children, his surviving children, and they in turn passed it down to their children, usually the oldest surviving child. And that's what you see here in this red circle. This is my great-great-grandmother. She inherited the homestead and the property from her father, William, and she was the oldest surviving child. In turn, she passed it down to my great-grandfather. So another collection that I want to point out to you is the resettlement program. This was a government program done by the government in the 1960s and 70s. It removed families from isolated communities, and it did that because they hoped to modernize and diversify the economy in Newfoundland and Labrador, and they felt that they wanted to remove people from communities that they didn't see had a future. These were communities that lacked work, access to medical and public services. People were offered, I think, $1,000 to resettle, but many of them weren't going to go quietly. Many of them had lived there for generations. They had built their homes, and as you can see here on the right, they floated their homes down to the new community where they were settling. The Maritime History Archives has a number of photos of these abandoned communities online, along with some digitized documents related to the resettlement program, and there is a complete list of the communities that were abandoned in both Newfoundland and Labrador. In this program, 200 communities were abandoned and 50,000 people were relocated. The Digital Archives Initiative is a digitization project that represents materials from the various libraries, archives, and departments that are on campus at the university. It has everything from diaries and letters to a growing collection of newspapers, maps, and land surveys. And I'd like to show you a couple of examples so you can get an idea of what they have. This is free and searchable. So this is the original remnant of the 1836 census representing the Fogo Island and surrounding communities in Notre Dame Bay. The 1836 census was the first census of the province, but the Fogo area is the only surviving nominal census. Everything else just remains statistical data for the rest of the province. Transcriptions have been online for a long time, but this is the first opportunity where we can actually see and access the original census. From the Peyton family collection, the Peytons had an extensive business and owned property up in the Twillingate area. Their collection is at the Archives and Special Collections at Queen Elizabeth II Library at Memorial University. And the university has undertaken the digitization project of the land surveys in this collection. And here you can see the properties in Wild Cove of George Rice, George Lee, and Albert Watkins. You also want to tap into local resources. One of the more interesting is the A.C. Hunter Public Library. They have a dedicated Newfoundland room on the 3rd floor of their library. They have a complete online genealogy guide that they recently updated a couple of years ago. They do offer interlibrary loan for some of their items, but I would reach out to them to make sure that goes beyond the province. The other thing is to check out local libraries and historical societies. I was very lucky in 2009 when I went to Fox Harbor. I visited the public library and they had a little museum there. And as I was chatting with the librarian, whom you see here in this photo, we both realized that we descended from Michael Foley, so I actually met a cousin as well. The other is to connect on social media where we can connect with folks and share our information. There are Newfoundland Facebook groups and of course DNA. Not only the autosomal from the popular ancestry, but also there is a mitochondrial DNA project by David Pike in Newfoundland that's also of interest. I want to take the next few minutes and just talk about the Marty O'Neill papers. I had showed the Jacob Taylor of Port de Grave from Keith Matthews. That was from her collection. Marty is a longtime member of NEHGS, and she donated her research to us a couple of years ago. And included with her research on her New England lines was original research and some family papers on her Newfoundland ancestors. And at the time she did her research, there was very little online, and you really needed to go to Newfoundland to do it. I have two goals here. First, I want to demonstrate to you through Marty's research notes and some of the documents that she found, her research process and what she found, and also just to demonstrate the importance of preserving genealogical research papers and how they can assist others when donated to a repository. So Marty's great-grandparents were Israel Taylor and Susanna Butler. They both were from the community of Port de Grave in Conception Bay. Each had roots that date back before the mid-18th century in that area, with Susanna's family, the Butlers, having a presence in Newfoundland dating back to the 1600s. They married in the Anglican Church there, but all their children were baptized as Methodists, and they continued to practice their Methodist faith after moving to Massachusetts in the 1880s. So when Marty first visited Newfoundland, she went straight to the provincial archives. That at one time, I think when she went, was in the old colonial building. She focused on church records, and she started with the Anglican Church in Port de Grave, St. Luke's Anglican Church, where she found the November of 1837 baptism of Israel Taylor. Okay, so when you see here the first arrow here on the top, near the top of the screen, she notes in parenthesis that she does not find Susanna's baptism, Susanna Butler's baptism, whom she knows was born about, 1838, 1839. Where you see the circle just below that, she makes a note of the fact that she could not find the marriage of Israel's parents, Robert Taylor and Rachel Boone, in the parish marriage records. And lastly, I want to draw your attention to the bottom of the screen. As Marty moved back in time, she shifted her search from the church records in Port de Grave to Harbor Grace. Why? Because Harbor Grace records began much earlier, in 1775. So she was searching for her Butlers and her Taylors there. And as a matter of fact, she found a lot of baptisms for several of her Butler ancestors in the Harbor Grace Anglican Church records. But Marty had to spread her research to surrounding communities. She had to take a look at other church records, and she found in the Bare Need Anglican Church records the marriage of Robert Taylor and Rachel Boone, Israel's parents, in January of 1837. And the marriage was performed by the Reverend Blackman, who was a Protestant Episcopal missionary. So many clergy at this time were doing circuit routes and traveling throughout these remote areas to perform marriages and baptisms in the churches. In her continued search for Susanna's baptism, Marty went back to Port de Grave and she looked in the Methodist church records, where she found a baptismal record for Susanna Butler Taylor. But it wasn't what she thought she would find. She assumed that she was looking for an infant baptism, because she knew that Susanna was probably born around 1838, 1839. But what's interesting is that she stumbled across Susanna and her siblings all being baptized on the same day, on the 2nd of September, 1849. It provides the actual date of birth for all of the children, including Susanna, and her date of birth was recorded as the 7th of February, 1839. So Susanna was baptized at the age of 10. Okay, so these are delayed baptisms. All of the records that I just showed you, the church records from the Anglican church records from Harbor Grace and Port de Grave and Bare Need, and the Methodist church records, can now all be found online. These were all transcribed through that project that I mentioned through the Department of Public Health and Welfare. And on the screen here, in the box here that I've highlighted in red, are the delayed baptisms of Susanna and her siblings. Marty employed a research strategy that I highly recommend, and that she looked at multiple denominations, but she also had to identify records in surrounding communities in order to find baptisms and marriages of her ancestors. In addition, Marty made use of manuscripts and other collections to supplement her family history on her visits to Newfoundland in 2003, 2004, and in 2009 when she came on the NEHGS research tour. She and I worked together and discovered some family papers belonging to the Butler family at the Rooms. But here's an example that Marty found in the Nimshi Crew collection. I mentioned Nimshi earlier. And in the 1960s, he was a research officer at the Provincial Archives, and he responded to many a genealogical inquiry from people around the world. And here in this typed letter, he's responding to an inquiry about the Butler and Daw family in Port de Grave. And where you see the arrow, he provides some extracts of marriages of butlers from the Methodist parish registers in Carbonear. So in addition to just answering questions, he actually extracted in his responses actual information from the records held at the Rooms. So it may be a while before we're able to take a research trip to Newfoundland and Labrador, but I thought I'd provide a few tips for a future visit. You know, planning ahead of time is key to a successful trip. Where the repositories are that you're going to need, searching their online catalogs and making the most of that, and with a special emphasis on any collections that focus on the people and community where your family lived. The starting point for all of us is at the Rooms, but I highly recommend visiting the Maritime History Archives and then, of course, going local. Because it's going local, we also are in touch with the people that live there. And we can make connections that way as well. Just as Marty did on her visit to Newfoundland in 2003 and 2004. In the meantime, there's a lot we can do from home. Yes, there are limitations to remote research and researching from a distance, but there's more and more records coming online for Newfoundland. Now, if you're just starting out, you want to stick to the tried and true methods of genealogical research. You want to begin with what you know and work back in time. You want to make a research plan, identify the records you need and where they're located. As you search online, don't overlook the resources at Memorial University. You know, kind of think outside that box. Focus on some of those unique records that I talked about, and also look at secondary sources. Read up on the local history of your ancestors' community, the families that live there. When you look at scholarly work, take a look at the footnotes, the bibliography. Look at the records that they consulted to study the families and communities and the immigration and settlement patterns. Lastly, don't give up. While it seems like there are a lot of challenges to Newfoundland research, as you can see here today, there are a lot of records at our fingertips. It's just knowing where to look and how to use the records to get the most out for our family history. I want to thank you for participating today in our online conference for Eastern English-speaking Canada. I hope that you found these sessions informative and hopefully have discovered something that will jumpstart your research. The staff here at NEHGS is here to assist you. So if you have questions in the future about your Canadian ancestors or any other lines you may have, please feel free to reach out to us at americanancestors.org. And thank you very much for participating today.